Hello and welcome to Roundtable. 12 months after more than 200 people died in a massive explosion in Lebanon's capital, the country has no proper government and is heading towards bankruptcy. This in a nation where unrest is a real threat to the stability of the Mediterranean region and European interests. The port explosion in Beirut only multiplied Lebanon's existing difficulties. Almost half the population now lives below the poverty line, yet the European Union is talking of sanctions and not aid. Is this the right way to get squabbling politicians in line and the country back from the brink? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. A failed state on Europe's doorstep. What would be the consequences? However, finding ways to stop a slide into potential anarchy and violence is proving very difficult indeed. This week marks the first anniversary of the Beirut port blast that left more than 200 dead and injured thousands. The country has been without a government for more than 9 months and is facing one of the world's worst economic crises. Around half the population is below the poverty line. The Lebanese pound has collapsed and there are shortages of fuel and medicine. The billionaire businessman Najib Mikati was appointed as Lebanon's new prime minister designate last week and has been given the task of forming a new government. France is leading the EU's plans to impose economic sanctions on Lebanon after months of pressurizing the country's political elite to implement economic and political reforms. This week, President Emmanuel Macron is hosting a donor conference to raise funds for the Lebanese people. Will aid or sanctions save Lebanon from state collapse? Well, all of our guests are in Beirut today. Karim Bitar joins us, Director of the Institute of Political Science at St. Joseph University of Beirut. Carmen Geha is with us, visiting fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations, and we also welcome the journalist Luna Safwan. The same question is going to be put to each one of you, but I'll start with you, Karim, if I may. During the course of the last 30 years, I've been in and out of Beirut countless times, probably 20, 25 times, and each time the people have said, give us time, give us the money, we'll sort this place out. Well, they've certainly had the time. So what's gone wrong?
We are facing unprecedented multidimensional crisis that was years in the making, decades in the making. Starting in the 1990s, Lebanon put in place unsustainable monetary and economic and fiscal policies. It was bound to collapse sooner or later. But this crisis was certainly aggravated in the past few years. We had to deal with the consequences of the war in Syria. We had Lebanese non-state actors like Hezbollah getting involved in proxy wars in Yemen and in Syria and in other countries. We had the consequences of Prime Minister Saad Hariri being held in Saudi Arabia. This also led to a huge capital flight. And most importantly, the Lebanese population lost any trust in the ruling kleptocracy, in this political and financial oligarchy that has been running the country for the past decades. And they have been running the country together, forming so-called national unity governments that rapidly become governments of national plurality.
So you called them kleptocrats, those who actually steal. I'll come back to you on that in just a moment because the allegations of corruption are legion. Carmen, let me come to you. The other thing I learned from everybody I spoke to in Beirut was that any unrest there, the ripples from that can go out into the broader Middle East, into Europe, indeed the wider world. So it's in everybody's interest to stop this becoming even more difficult. And if people know what has gone wrong and they know who is to blame, why aren't those people being held to account?
Thanks for asking. I think when we portray the problems in Lebanon to be so complex, we're actually doing ourselves a disfavor. This is not a complicated situation. Many countries that experience civil wars end up with a power sharing agreement. This was one way to get the warlords to go down from their tanks and have a share in parliament and in the government. Over the years, they have devised very intricate web of relationships with the international community, with Gulf states, with Lebanese abroad, until those ties literally exploded. And we saw the result of having this kind of system in the Beirut port explosion. This coincided with a growing awareness of the international community to join in the calls with the Lebanese people and say that there needs to be a break with the old. It is in nobody's interest, and we're not victims here. We're not saying the world should help us, but we're saying there is shared interest in a stable and a prosperous Lebanon, and not a Lebanon that exports terrorism, narcotics, human trafficking networks, and explosives to the rest of the region and the world. And so we're saying there is a great interest today, if the European Union wants to do the right thing, to be able to partner with local institutions, universities, media institutions, hospitals, activists, business leaders, and do the right thing.
But that's all very well until those with vested interests, part of the kleptocracy, part of the powerful elite, the warlords and their families, until they suddenly say we're getting something taken away that we still want to keep. So, Luna, I'm going to come to you now, and I'm going to say, as somebody who's sort of watching this from inside rather than outside, as I am, do you believe that things will ever change?
We have a multiple crises. We have an economic crisis. We have a political crisis. We have a security crisis that is happening in Lebanon. The problem is so broad that it became very hard to dissect it and to understand where did it exactly start and where would it end. What I would say is that there is a way forward in this, from what we're hearing, from what we're covering in the streets, from what we're witnessing. And it starts basically with democracy. It starts with the hope of the 2022 elections. Anyone you talk to in the streets, any analyst you talk to, any political activist you talk to, they all insist that there is something to look forward to in the 2020 elections. However, as I said, the problem is so deep in Lebanon, it's so complex that you can no longer count on the elections and on democracy alone. You also need an economic reform. You also need a judiciary system to hold people accountable.
Okay, well, we'll come to the ways of fixing it in a moment, but echoing your thoughts about how the people no longer trust the elite, these are the thoughts of some people that we were able to hear in Beirut itself. Ordinary folk in an ordinary country facing extraordinary times.
He's made several deals to steal from the state. How am I supposed to trust a thief who has stole from me and my children and their future? You can't trust this person.
We already tried him, and we don't want to make the same mistake again. We are already in a big mess. We've tried the current politicians, and we won't make the same mistake again. We want someone new, someone young, someone competent.
It's not tied to one person, it's tied to something larger. In the end, Najib Mikati is the result of a settlement, a result of the composition of the country's ruling class. We had wanted someone different, but the ruling class in Lebanon forces settlements on you, and the choice is the one we're left with.
I don't believe any government in this current era can succeed. We're going towards further deterioration and the hardest days the Lebanese people have ever faced.
We hear Karim there from Luna, who's suggesting that it's so convoluted, it's very difficult to see the beginning from the end, or even the middle, or possibly a way out of this. But isn't that part of the brilliance, if you like, of the kleptocracy that you talk about, that they know that people won't be able to unravel it very easily, which therefore makes it impossible perhaps to sort out?
Yes, absolutely. Many Lebanese came to the conclusion that the only language that these kleptocrats understand is the language of sanctions, international targeted sanctions, freezing the assets of corrupt politicians in Europe. Issuing travel bans would be a significant first step. It would contribute to delegitimizing this political class a few months before the legislative elections that are supposed to take place in May 2022. And the reason I use the expression kleptocracy is that Lebanon has received billions of dollars of international aid and incoming capital flows. Senior economists have estimated that in a 20-year period after the end of the civil war, Lebanon has received no less than $170 billion, which is roughly the equivalent in terms of purchasing power of what the United States spent when it issued the Marshall Plan to help rebuild 15 European countries.
And where's that money ended up? 170 billion, where's it gone?
Well, it has vanished. It was squandered by this kleptocracy. $170 billion evaporated, and we don't even have 3 hours of electricity per day. 55% of the Lebanese population, according to the UN, live under the poverty line. According to a UNICEF report, 30% of Lebanese children are skipping meals or going to bed hungry. And we even have 15% of families who have decided no longer to send their children to school.
Carmen, sorry, I'm going to stop you for just a moment, Karim. The catalogue is long and it is terrible, thank you. Why aren't these people who've stolen all this money, 170 billion, perhaps not quite that amount, maybe some of it's trickled down, but why aren't they behind bars?
Well, accountability in Lebanon has always been very hard to reach. The main reason being the Lebanese sectarian system. Sectarianism in Lebanon is the last refuge of the scoundrels, the last refuge of the corrupt. They always try to portray themselves as victims of a conspiracy conducted by leaders of other sects.
So same question to you, Carmen. Karim, thank you. Thanks very much indeed. Same question to you, Carmen, if I may, as I get my notes in order. Sectarianism referenced by Karim. The president has to be a Christian. The Speaker of the House has to be a Shia. The Prime Minister has to be a Sunni. It was meant to be fair for all, but it's ended up being fair for only those people in power and not the people.
Yeah, but I think that the identity of the leaders right now isn't the core problem. The core problem is that nobody has been able to investigate accounts of mismanagement and corruption. Even now, 1 year later after the explosion, there's not been a headway in the explosion investigation. You asked, where could all this money disappear? I don't know. I've been on the streets for the last 17 years. I've tried everything I can. We've tried to vote them out. We've tried to sit in on parliamentary deliberation. We've tried to ask for public budgets. I think it's time for the international donors to start looking at, what has this money achieved? How is it that they've been spending so much on things like refugees and gender and poverty and electricity and entrepreneurship loans with really nothing to show? Today, the only reason that you don't see millions and hundreds of thousands of Lebanese on the shore is because people's money is stuck in the banks. Otherwise, you would witness massive wave of forced immigration. And so the call today is for the international community to help us think through what went wrong and not to put partisan interest over the interest of people.
And will the international community, if it decides on sanctions, be making the right step? Or does it need to hold on, give some money if there is any kind of reasonably stable government under IMF conditions, give some money, see where that goes? Or does it really, really have to pile the pressure on by confiscating money, travel bans, and saying you'll only get the money if that happens?
Yeah, I think it's possible to do both. And we can, there's precedent about this, that you can put money in state institutions, exercise maximum level of oversight and vigilance, involve local communities and civil society to monitor the money being spent, while also sanctioning individuals with a track record of having stolen this money. Most of it is taxpayers' money, by the way. That's not coming from me, but from European citizens and American citizens. And so I think we have the opportunity to do the right thing here. It's complex, but I think if we picture it as too complex, we do the situation a disservice. They're bad politicians that have held on for too long. There are many reasons why they've held on, but we have an opportunity now to do the right thing and turn the page in Lebanon. But we need to act collectively, and we need to be very assertive. and we need to put people and the stability of the country over partisan interest. And here only multilateralism would work. France alone cannot, the US alone cannot,
Well,
we alone cannot.
Can we talk about France in just a moment? I'm going to quote from Joseph Borrell, who's the Foreign Affairs representative for the European Union. A message of firmness to all Lebanese political leaders on behalf of the EU. The crisis Lebanon is facing is a domestic crisis, a self-imposed crisis, not a crisis coming from abroad or from external factors. Only an urgent agreement with the International Monetary Fund will rescue the country from a financial collapse, and there is no time to waste. Well, we've been hearing about the power cuts in Lebanon, so no surprise perhaps that we've lost Carmen Geha. We will continue with Luna and with Karim. Let me come to you first of all, Luna. So there we have Joseph Borrell saying need the IMF loan now, but we know that Lebanon won't get it until there's a stable government. There isn't a stable government right now. Let's hope there is. But if there isn't and Lebanon does not get the money, what happens to the country?
You have civil unrest, you have roads being blocked randomly, you have violence erupting at gas stations. Sometimes you have people fighting over bread and over milk. These are the basics. More inflation will happen. It's inevitable. And this will lead to more violence. And I think this is what leads us to think that, sure, if the international community recognizes more civil society groups, the way that happened in the last meeting President Macron had in Lebanon, if the international community recognizes more private entrepreneurship of students and of senior students and of people who are able to develop projects that can be sustainable and that can be eco-friendly.
Well, we've already heard about Lebanese power cuts. We've lost both Carmen and Luna. We believe, probably because of technical difficulties in Beirut. Karim, it'll be just you and me for the time being. So Joseph Borrell is saying money urgently needed from the IMF. The money's only going to come if there's a stable government. So first of all, how does Lebanon get a stable government?
Well, a new prime minister was designated last week. He still has to find a modus vivendi with the various political groups to form a government. It has become a matter of national emergency. Lebanon needs to start negotiating with the International Monetary Fund as soon as possible, because I'm afraid the cold hard truth is that there is no plan B. If Lebanon does not get $10 to $15 billion of US hard cash in the next few months, we will be heading towards a complete state collapse. So Mr. Borrell is perfectly right to be worried, but I have to say that the international community should take part of the blame, because for the past 20 years, they have been offering a lifeline to a corrupt political establishment through financial aid, through organizing international conferences, and they did not show enough toughness. They should be very strict today and insist on the conditionalities of aid. And the supreme irony is that the policies that are advocated today by the IMF are much more progressive than anything that we have witnessed in Lebanon. So usually people in the West are cautious about the IMF. They think that it is going to impose austerity measures, but actually in Lebanon, the corruption is so widespread, the mismanagement has become so rampant that an IMF program would be welcome even by the Lebanese middle classes.
I want to ask you this. You say there needs to be a new government very, very quickly. The caretaker prime minister is in place to do that. And yet the European authorities have suggested it needs to be a government of technocrats, those capable of running things, as opposed to a government of politicians. Is that at all likely?
I think that they do need to have technocratic abilities, but most importantly, they need to be independent reformers, independent from all political clans, from all feudal lords, from all members of the financial oligarchy that has been ruling the country. Because the problem is that the militias that we have and the sectarian parties also have their own technocrats, and ideally they will try to bring those technocrats who are in their pockets and put them in the government. What we need is independent, courageous reformers that will be able to speak truth to the Lebanese people and to speak truth to the international community, and to start very rapidly with the structural and sectorial reforms that Lebanon needs, starting with electricity and also healthcare and education.
And are those people available?
Yes, they are available. There are thousands of young, committed Lebanese men and women who have technical solutions to every single problem. They have written dozens of policy papers. The problem is that there is a very tiny elite that is controlling all the levers of political power in Lebanon. Lebanon used to be a consociational parliamentary liberal democracy. Today it is an oligarchy, and only 6 sectarian leaders decide everything. So the problem is not how to solve these technical issues, how to offer policy solutions. The problem is how to get rid of the corrupt oligarchs that have been squandering the country's money for the past decades.
Okay, well, Karim, listen, we can give you time to catch your breath because we've re-established the connection with Luna Safwan, and Karim's been telling us about what he believes to be the cabal that runs Lebanon, has done for 35, 40 years, that appears to be in no hurry to get out of power. But I want to ask you, not just in terms of the practical side of what happens if Lebanon doesn't get the money, but what happens in terms of the geopolitics of the region. The ripples go out from Lebanon. If it becomes a failed state, what happens? What are the consequences?
I have to agree that when we talk about politics in Lebanon, we do talk about a cartel that's been in power. We talk about different political parties being involved locally, but also regionally. And this goes to the extent of regional deals that everyone is waiting for. For example, everyone right now is kind of tying what happens in Lebanon to the nuclear deal in Iran. Even though this is taking a long time, and even though this can't be a promise, Lebanon shouldn't count on any state outside of our state for it to be a stable, productive country. So everyone is thinking that if things somehow settle in the nuclear deal, then there will be some kind of solution in Lebanon. But in Lebanon, we're not talking about normal solutions. We have a regional problem in Lebanon that goes beyond local politics. We have a political party that claims to be a local party that embedded itself with different regional scenarios and with different regional wars. And the solution to this is an agreement that needs to be stabilized in Lebanon and that needs to be finalized in Lebanon for everyone to know this entity that holds its weapons and that can trigger wars with Israel, with other countries around the region, which did control the narrative in Lebanon for a long time and which proved to also be involved in the corruption. Even though, and we're talking here about Hezbollah, even though they did say and they did claim many times that they are not embedded in the corruption, but they are because they knew about so many deals that were happening, including power deals, internet deals that were happening, and they chaperoned those deals one way or another. So unless we have a solution that stabilizes the situation related to these weapons that are tied to regional politics, then we won't have a stable political situation in Lebanon.
Luna, great to get you back on the line. Karim, probably got a minute or so to wrap this one up, maybe a little bit longer. What if the ripples go even further afield than Iran, than Israel, than Saudi Arabia? What if they come into Europe, into the Mediterranean countries? What then? What instability then?
Lebanon has historically paid a very heavy price for all the regional proxy wars that took place on its territory. Today, the time has come to dissociate Lebanon from all regional proxy wars and to focus exclusively on rebuilding our institutions, on strengthening our national Lebanese army, on empowering a new generation of men and women who could become a new political class. The Lebanese people, by and large, are sick and tired of being ruled by feudal lords and antediluvian war criminals and militias with foreign allegiances. The time has come for a complete overhaul of the Lebanese political system, and it is of the utmost importance to prevent Lebanon from being caught in this regional Iranian-Saudi tug of war that has been lasting for the past 15 years. And some people are advocating for neutrality in Lebanon. It will be complicated to put in place. However, dissociating ourselves from all regional proxy wars and putting an end to this unhealthy polarization between one Lebanese camp, which is supported by Iran, and another Lebanese camp, which is closer to the United States and Saudi Arabia, is absolutely fundamental today. It should be a priority because we have to deal with bread and butter issues, with the consequences of the financial crisis, and we no longer have the ability or the energy to focus about conflicts in Yemen or in other places.
Thank you. Thank you, Karim. Thank you very much indeed. Luna, a familiar, terrible story of other powers using Lebanon's backyard to fight out their own different battles for whatever various reasons that always seem to be to the detriment of the Lebanese people themselves. Thank you both very, very much indeed. Be interesting to see whether we're still talking about this in another 10 years. As I say, I first came across it 36 years ago. Nothing very much appears to have changed. Let's hope this time that's different. For me, David Foster, goodbye.